All right, so are you ready to dive into a mystery that has kind of gripped Chicago for years now? We're talking about the potential existence of a serial killer. They call him the Chicago Strangler. We'll be taking excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the subject. It details a chilling series of unsolved murders, and get this, spanning nearly 2 decades. What makes this case so perplexing, so fascinating, is the sheer number of victims, the eerie similarities in their deaths, and the debate about whether one or multiple perpetrators are involved.
It's interesting. What's particularly interesting about this case is that it highlights the tension, the real tension, between how investigations have been done traditionally and the new way, the modern data analysis way.
Yeah.
We have the Murder Accountability Project, MAP, flagging these cases as potentially linked, and they're basing that on their algorithm. And then you have the Chicago Police Department. They remain skeptical,
Yeah.
although they do acknowledge there is a pattern.
It's definitely a case that makes you think, is there a Chicago Strangler? Is there not? Let's start by setting the scene. We're talking about Chicago, a city with a rich, albeit complicated history. Beginning in 2001, a chilling trend began to surface. Women, predominantly black women, and often involved in sex work, were found strangled in various locations across the city. And the number is pretty staggering, isn't it?
It is.
51 women aged 18 to 58 fit this pattern. And it's this consistency that really caught the attention of MAP. Can you tell us a bit more about their approach and how they use data to identify potential serial killer activity?
Sure. So MAP's algorithm, it's designed to detect statistical anomalies in homicide data. So essentially, it looks for clusters of murders that share unusual similarities. This could be victim profiles, cause of death, even location, patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed, especially in a large city like Chicago. And in this case, the algorithm flagged a significant number of strangulations, and importantly, of women fitting a particular demographic. So that raised a red flag that these deaths might be connected.
So, MAP's algorithm is saying potential serial killer, but the Chicago PD isn't officially linking these cases. That seems like a pretty big disconnect. What are some of the reasons for the CPD's hesitation? Is it simply a matter of needing more concrete evidence, or are there other factors at play?
Well, you've hit on a key point. The
Yeah.
CPD, they often rely on hard evidence, things like DNA, witness testimonies, or confessions, to build a case. Statistical probability, even when it's really compelling, it doesn't always meet the standards,
Right.
the rigorous standards of legal evidence required for prosecution.
Yeah.
And additionally, you have 25 of the cases that fit the pattern that were closed, and 13 men are serving time for those crimes. Now, while that may seem to weaken the serial killer theory on the surface, it also adds another layer of complexity.
Right.
Were those 25 cases truly unrelated? Or were some of those convictions potentially wrongful,
Hmm.
obscuring the larger pattern? It's hard to say.
That's a fascinating and disturbing thought. The possibility of wrongful convictions intertwined with this larger mystery. It definitely raises questions about how these investigations are conducted, particularly when it comes to cases involving marginalized communities. We often hear about systemic biases impacting these kinds of investigations. How might those biases be playing a role here?
It's an important question to consider. When you look at cases involving victims on the margins of society, like those involved in sex work, they may sometimes receive less attention, fewer resources, and that can impact the thoroughness of the investigation. Additionally, there might be a reluctance among some witnesses to come forward, maybe due to distrust of law enforcement or fear of repercussions.
Sure.
These factors can create significant hurdles for investigators trying to piece together the puzzle.
It's a stark reminder that behind the statistics and the mystery are real people, each with a story, loved ones left behind, and a community impacted by their loss. The Wikipedia article mentions some of their names. Angela Ford, 32 years old, Yvette Mason, 35. These weren't just numbers, these were lives tragically cut short.
Absolutely. And it's those individual lives, those families seeking answers that should remain at the forefront as we delve deeper into this mystery. I mean, while it's tempting to get lost in the analysis, the data, and the theories, we must never forget the human cost of these crimes.
Absolutely. Speaking of delving deeper, let's look at the geographic element of this case. We know that many of these murders were clustered on the south and west sides of Chicago, specifically in areas like Washington Park and Garfield Park. These areas, unfortunately, have histories of crime and drug use. How might this clustering inform our understanding of the case? Does it lend more weight to the serial killer theory, or are there other, perhaps more complex, explanations?
That's where things get even more intriguing. On the one hand, the clustering could suggest a perpetrator with a strong familiarity with these specific areas,
Hmm.
someone who blends in and exploits their knowledge of the neighborhoods. It creates an unsettling image, right,
Yeah.
of a predator with a defined hunting ground, so to speak. But on the other hand,
It also raises questions about vulnerability, right?
absolutely.
Do those areas see higher rates of these crimes simply because they are home to populations that are already more vulnerable due to socioeconomic factors, limited access to resources, and systemic inequalities? It makes you wonder how much this clustering is about the potential perpetrator's choices and how much it's a reflection of the environment itself.
Precisely. It's not a simple equation.
Right.
And that's what makes this case so compelling. It forces us to consider the interplay of individual actions, societal factors, and investigative practices. I mean, unraveling the mystery of the Chicago Strangler might require us to confront uncomfortable truths about the city itself,
Yeah, it's a bit like looking at a tapestry.
where some threads are missing and others are just tangled. I mean, we can see the outlines
Yeah.
of a potential serial killer.
Yeah.
But the picture, it isn't complete.
And it sounds like that incompleteness, that lack of a full picture, is feeding the controversy surrounding this case.
Yeah.
You have MAP's data analysis pointing in one direction, but traditional investigative methods are struggling to keep pace. Is it possible to reconcile these two approaches, or are we looking at a fundamental clash between data science and traditional police work?
I think it's an evolving landscape.
Okay.
Law enforcement agencies, they are increasingly using data analysis to inform their investigations. But it's still a relatively new tool in their arsenal.
Yeah.
So there can be a learning curve when it comes to interpreting data,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And using it effectively to guide investigative decisions.
So it's not necessarily a case of one approach being right and the other wrong, but rather a need for both sides to adapt and find ways to work together.
Exactly.
But even with the best data analysis and investigative techniques, there's still the human element to consider.
Oh, absolutely.
Witnesses, for instance, play a crucial role in many investigations. But in this case, with victims often on the fringes of society, how reliable are those witness accounts likely to be? And what challenges might investigators face in gaining the trust of those who could hold vital information?
Well, that's a critical point. I mean, building that trust with marginalized communities, it's absolutely essential for successful investigations.
Yeah.
Witnesses might be hesitant to come forward for a number of reasons. Fear of retaliation, a distrust of authority, maybe even they've had previous negative experiences with law enforcement.
Right.
And overcoming those barriers, it requires sensitivity, it requires understanding, it requires a commitment to building bridges with the communities most affected.
It's a reminder that effective policing goes beyond just solving crimes.
Oh, for sure.
It's also about building relationships. It's about understanding the nuances of different communities. And it's about addressing the root causes of vulnerability. Speaking of vulnerability, let's go back to the potential motives behind these killings. If there is a serial killer, or even multiple killers at work, what might be driving them? Is it the power and control dynamic we often see in these cases, or are there other, perhaps less obvious, factors to consider?
The power and control dynamic, that's definitely a strong possibility.
Yeah.
Serial killers often derive a sense of satisfaction, even a thrill,
Right.
from dominating, from ultimately taking the lives of their victims. It's this twisted sense of agency and control, especially when they're targeting individuals they perceive as vulnerable, as marginalized.
Yeah.
However,
There could also be other factors at play, right?
Right.
Like sexual sadism,
Sure.
deeper psychological issues, even copycat crimes inspired by media coverage. And with the lack of a clear motive in many of the cases, profiling the potential perpetrator becomes even more challenging, doesn't it?
it really does.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of complexity to an already multifaceted investigation.
Yeah.
I mean, without a clear motive, investigators are left piecing together fragments of information, looking for subtle patterns, subtle connections that might shed light on the killer's psyche, on their modus operandi.
So we have this puzzle, and it has missing pieces, a complex web of social factors, potential investigative biases, and a lack of clear motive. It's no wonder this case has lingered for so long. But with all those challenges, is there still hope for resolution? Could advances in forensic science, like DNA analysis, eventually provide the breakthrough needed to solve this mystery?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, technology is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
What might have been impossible to trace years ago could now be analyzed with way greater precision. DNA technology in particular, that is becoming increasingly sophisticated.
Right.
Re-examining old evidence with new techniques, that could potentially yield new leads. It could even directly link a suspect to multiple crime scenes.
So even though the trail might seem cold, there's always a possibility that new evidence or a fresh perspective could reignite the investigation. It's important to remember that cold cases can and do get solved, sometimes years or even decades later. But what about the impact on the families of the victims, those left behind with unanswered questions and the constant ache of loss? How does the passage of time affect their pursuit of justice and closure?
Well, it's difficult to imagine the weight of grief and uncertainty they carry.
Yeah.
For them, the passage of time, it doesn't diminish the need for answers, the hope for justice. It might flicker, but it never truly goes out.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about those families left behind with so many unanswered questions. We've been talking about the potential for forensic breakthroughs and the importance of continued investigation, but is there anything else that can be done, to support those families and help them find some, I don't know, some semblance of peace?
Well, support for the families of victims, it goes beyond just solving the crime.
Yeah.
It's about providing resources for counseling, for grief support, for advocacy. Organizations dedicated to helping families navigate the aftermath of a violent crime, I think those can play a vital role in their healing process.
And it's not just about the families. The ripple effect of these crimes extends to whole communities, right?
Hmm.
How does a case like this, with its lingering uncertainty and potential for a serial predator, how does that impact the social fabric of a city like Chicago?
Well, it creates this climate of fear,
Yeah,
particularly for women who fit the victim profile.
right.
People might be afraid to go out alone or even to just live their lives freely. And that fear, it can have a huge chilling effect on daily life. It can erode the sense of safety and security that's so essential for a thriving community.
So it's not just about catching the perpetrator, but also about addressing that fear and restoring that sense of security. What steps can be taken to mitigate those anxieties and help communities heal even while the investigation continues?
Well, I think increased police presence, especially in affected areas, that can provide some sense of reassurance.
Okay.
Community outreach programs can be helpful, self-defense classes, public forums where people can actually voice their concerns
Sure.
and get access to support services. All of those can contribute, I think, to a sense of empowerment,
Right.
a sense of collective resilience.
It sounds like it's about empowering communities, not just policing them, giving people the tools and the resources to feel safe and supported, rather than just reacting to fear. But this case also brings up, broader societal issues.
Absolutely.
Poverty, marginalization, systemic biases. How do we address those root causes of vulnerability and prevent future tragedies?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It requires a real multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
Investing in social programs, addressing the economic disparities, providing greater access to education, to opportunities, challenging the biases that make certain groups more vulnerable to violence. It's a long-term commitment. It's a real shift, a shift in societal values and priorities.
It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe, valued, and protected. A society that doesn't just react to crime, but actively works to prevent it by addressing the root causes. That's a huge challenge, but it's one we have to face.
It is. It absolutely is. And the Chicago Strangler case, while chilling, it offers a real chance to confront those challenges head on. It compels us to look beyond this immediate mystery, to examine the systemic issues that create an environment where tragedies like this can occur.
It's a stark reminder that these aren't just isolated incidents. They reflect deeper societal issues, and those demand our attention. So, as we wrap up our deep dive today, let's leave our listener with this. How can we each, in our own way, contribute to building a safer, more equitable world? How can we challenge biases, advocate for the marginalized, and push for solutions that address the root causes of crime and violence? These are questions worth pondering, as we continue to grapple with the complex realities that cases like the Chicago Strangler illuminate.
Because understanding the darkness is often the first step towards creating light.